All of us follow more than we lead. I don't think anybody would argue with that. It doesn't get the hoopla that leadership does. But first of all, I would suggest Christians follow Christ. Jesus himself said, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." If we're a true believer, then all of us are followers of Jesus Christ. That is a role that we play. We follow governing officials. We follow elders. Wives follow husbands. Children follow parents. And so while following dominates our lives, it doesn't tend to dominate our thinking. And again, for those of you who have secular jobs working in organizations, so much is talked about leadership, but very little is talked about followership. And we're going to try to rectify that as we proceed through the content of this material. And so the thing is this, as I've been saying, you can't really talk about what makes a good leader without talking about followers. In fact, let me plant this seed. How good a follower you are hinges to a large extent about how well you're led. Does that make sense? That if you're going to be a fully functioning, fully engaged follower, more often than not, it's because you are being led effectively. And sometimes when we see people who become what I might refer to as alienated followers, turned off, not willing to engage in much work, sometimes it's because they're not being led appropriately. And so my contention, and I would share this with leaders and organizations all the time, try to focus on the fact that if you're really going to be a better leader, you've got to know your followers and what kind of followers they are. And so I would like to begin, and we're going to hand out some workbooks. And let me make a point about this before we begin to distribute these. There is a workbook that goes with this, and it is a workbook. There's places in here to make decisions, think through some things, share some observations. As I said, this is not a sermon. It's not me talking all the time. I want to engage you as well. But before we hand these out, I want you to promise me something. Don't look ahead. Now, the moment I say that, people get really interested in what's ahead that he doesn't want me to see. But I think it will be more helpful if you will learn as we go. And certain things will be revealed that I don't want you to see prematurely, okay? Is that fair? And I hope all of you will be able to continue to come for tomorrow's 3 sessions. It might be worthwhile just put your name on here and leave the books here when you depart from our session this evening, so you don't happen to mislay it or forget to bring it, and we'll take up tomorrow. All right, whomever would like to help me, we're going to go ahead and begin to hand these out. And again, please don't look ahead. We're going to try to, there's more over there. I don't know how many you want here. 3? Okay. All right, 2 over here. 2. You got that whole row? 1, 2, 3, 4. Ready? Do you need one more here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll do these 2, you do those 2. Okay. All right, does everybody have a copy? And again, you don't want to get too far ahead of me here. Don't look ahead. I'll direct you to the pages when it's time for us to turn there. What we're going to do is what I often do in the corporate work around leadership. And we're to begin by trying to differentiate between 2 roles that are often confused. This is a confusion that exists in corporate America. And the 2 roles are leader and manager. And interestingly, the Bible actually makes mention of these. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, we're told, obey your leaders and submit to them. And in 1 Timothy 3:4, in the qualifications for an elder, the term manage is employed. And so I want to begin by having you think for a few moments, what is the difference between a leader and a manager? And so on page 3 in your books, you can turn there now, I want you to jot down some thoughts. And by the way, as you look up at the screen here, you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, there'll always be the page number that we're referencing in our discussion, all right? So it's your turn, just a brain dump. If you were called to give your best judgment of the difference between management and leadership, what would be the difference? And you can use a word or a phrase. You don't have to write a standard definition. What are the terms, the words that you would use to differentiate between manager and leader? So take a couple of moments and capture your own thoughts. Okay, capture the last few thoughts that are occurring to you. I know it's a Friday afternoon, everybody's ready to relax, and now I'm putting you to work. Bear with me. All right, what we're going to do, anybody want to take the lead in sharing a phrase or a word that you would use to describe, let's start with leadership. What's a word, a phrase, a thought that comes to mind that you would suggest really is what leadership is all about? Yes, sir. Inspire others, somebody who inspires others, okay? Somebody else still talking about leadership?
One who provides direction, vision, goals, identifies actions that need to be.
Okay, we got a whole litany here, provides direction, vision, goals. In fact, very often when I use this with senior level leaders, the very first word that we hear for leadership is the V word, vision. Okay? But it is interesting, and I'll share this with you, that when I get into this discussion with the actual leaders and managers, there is some difference of opinion. You would think that if somebody aspires to being a good leader, they know what it looked like. They'd be able to articulate that to which they aspire to. But more often than not, people don't ever stop to think, what's the difference between management and leadership? Nobody wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. What's the difference between management and leadership? I really need to know this. It's almost like the first time they've ever given any thought to it when I'm doing this in organizations. So somebody else, other words you would use to describe leader? Yes. The first person to what? Okay, walk the path that they're leading people down. Okay. Somebody else? Yes. Serving others so they can succeed. And again, that's very much in vogue these days, the idea of servant leadership, which kind of turns the old thinking about leadership on its ear. Have you ever had a supposed leader where you work who cared very little about what his or her followers thought, and it was my way or the highway? That's a very, very different approach than what is being suggested now, that we have to be much, much more a servant. And that almost, at least historically, seems like a contradiction. But I think we're spot on when we begin to talk about that. Anything else about leader? Yes?
Focuses on the growth and development of others.
Growth and development of others, so people focus perhaps. All right? Somebody else? Yes, sir? Influence for desired outcomes. Now, would that be different than a manager? Does a manager not influence for desired outcomes?
Yeah, I contrast that. The way that influence might occur is through reward or discipline.
Okay, all right. So we're beginning to look at the tools in the arsenal of a manager or leader that he or she might employ to get the followers to do his or her bidding. All right, good, good. Somebody else? We're still talking about leader. That's the fun one. Go ahead.
A leader to me is someone I want to emulate. They influence me to be a better self, and I want to do what they're doing.
Okay, that there is kind of this, I mean, we sometimes hear words like aura, or their attitude, something about this person draws me to them, all right, where I want to emulate them. I want to be more like them. Have you ever had a leader like that? Now, my contention is one of the reasons that I'm doing this workshop is because I think we have a crisis of leadership. Not only in our country, but in the church. And, you know, I can say that because I don't know about this congregation, but from my perspective and a variety of congregations, I don't see as many people stepping up to leadership roles as I would like to see. I don't see as many people that others would like to emulate or be like or are willing to follow into the fire, if you will. And that concerns me. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to put this workshop together. All right, anybody else? Any things that you had that we want to make sure is spoken of about leaders? Anybody else? Yes? Okay, so willing to be vulnerable, to share both what I have done, but also what didn't go so well. Willing to own up sometimes to having made a mistake. Rather than blaming others when things don't go well, I sometimes hear people describe a leader as somebody who is willing to take the responsibility and own up, take the responsibility even when things aren't quite what they should be. All right, anybody else? We're going to quickly go into management. Yes, sir. Engaged and invested. All right, good. All right, let's talk about management. How is management different than leadership? Yes.
One of the things someone else said for leadership was have a case of example. Management seems more instruction-based as opposed to example-based.
Okay, so maybe training somebody on what to do, on-the-job training, something along that line, whereas a leader sometimes is simply by his or her example, creating followers. People want to follow. Okay, good. Somebody else? Yes.
Controlling, organizing, or utilizing resources.
Okay, so very much resource-focused. Somebody once suggested that the leaders kind of chart the path, the managers make sure we have the resources to get there, to get it done. And we'll speak to that in just a moment. Anybody else? Manager? Yes?
Something I probably would have to do to follow the rules of this management, but it's not something I
Okay, and that goes to your earlier comment that a leader has the capacity to draw us, whereas sometimes a manager pushes us. Is there a difference? Yeah, there's a difference. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, you've got a 92.3 on the aura scale. What a great leader you are. No, because frankly, a manager is really tied to metrics, measurements, okay? Output. Did we accomplish what we said we were going to accomplish? Whereas somebody who's a leader, and this is why there's so many books written about it, because it's somewhat mysterious. It's somehow hard to quantify what makes a good leader. All right, anybody else? Manager, yes. Say that again?
You lead people, you manage process.
Okay, you lead people, you manage process, okay? Do you work somewhere?
My dad's been a manager for like.
Okay, all right. First-hand experience. Yes. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think we want to make sure we don't give a bad name to management. Management is necessary. Management is good, but it's different than leadership. And I'll just, as we move on here, I just want to share with you that the difference between management and leadership, I've had some really knockdown, drag-out fights among C-suite, upper-level leaders and organizations about this very thing, management and leadership. There's a lot of debate, a lot of differences of opinion. There isn't absolute agreement. Yes? Okay, that would be an interesting distinction because while he's in Egypt, he's taking care of all of the provisions for the 7 lean years that are going to be coming, managing that circumstance or situation. Interesting, okay, observation. Sometimes we look at biblical characters, David or Moses or Joshua, as you've suggested. Yes, sir. Okay, so managers, good managers, typically have a wealth of experience upon which to draw in ensuring that we accomplish what we're setting out to accomplish. Does that kind of capture what the point you're making? And I would argue that, in fact, I'll just share with you, and let's see how well what you've written correlate to. This is kind of a distillation of a number of the books that I've read on the difference or the distinctions between leading and managing. Leaders communicate vision, mission, inspire and motivate people, provide an example to follow. Leadership is more long-term and broad in focus. And I heard a lot of comments that kind of resonated with those distinctions and those bullet points. One author, a guy by the name of Warren Bennis, who has written a number of the books, he makes a funny little statement. He says, good leaders do the right things. Managers direct and control people, administer things and tasks, coordinate efforts. Management is more short-term, implementation focus. And here's his little play on words. Good leaders do the right things. Good managers do things right. Now, I think that's probably a fair summation, and I heard very much that coming from everybody in this room. I would like to make the contention, and the way I kind of set up this first session was, what is the single most critical component of an effective leader? And purpose is really what we're talking about when we talk about leaders. They're the ones who are articulating where we're going, whereas managers are more concerned, and I think somebody said this, with process. How best to do things, how best to get there. Is that distinction clear? Leaders are kind of 30,000 foot. This is where we're headed. Managers help us to accomplish that by making sure we have the resources in place to make it a reality. Now, let me ask this question. I think it's at the bottom of your, would you rather be managed or led? That's not a rhetorical question. Would you rather be managed or led? Think about it. Would you rather be managed or led? Most people would prefer to be led. That's my assessment. When I ask people, I ask employees of organizations, would you rather be managed or led? 201, even if we can't agree on what we do in leadership. Meaning, 201, they said, I'd rather be led. I'd rather be led. And I think that's interesting. And while we might not be able to reach agreement on how to define them, almost there is uniformity of agreement on the fact that almost everybody, I really am looking for somebody to manage me. I need to be managed. Now, maybe if they've got a problem with self-control, they do need to be managed, but most people would rather be led. In fact, I often will make this statement. You take 50 people who are managed, and you put them up against 50 people who are led. The 50 people who are led will outdo the 50 who are managed. Now, again, I don't mean to suggest that management isn't crucial or necessary. But that internalization, the being drawn by a leader, the example that is set, that we want to emulate them, we internalize the rightness of their direction, that tends to spark something in people that management doesn't always do or accomplish. All right? And we're going to be coming back to this a little bit later. But the crucial factor in leadership is purpose. And let me speak to that a little bit after we talk about the objectives, what we're going to try to accomplish. That little exercise was to get you talking. But after this workshop, you'll be able to explain the difference between managing and leading, explain the crucial factor, this is page 5 in your materials, to leader effectiveness, define leadership in a practical, usable way. I'm going to give you a definition of leadership that you will never forget. So simple is it. But also contained within that simple definition is some practical insight about how to be a better leader. So we'll get to that a little bit later. We'll get to that tomorrow. We're going to identify 5 different types of followers. Well, everybody in this room is a follower. There are different types of followers. And we're going to identify 5 different types of followers, and we're going to identify different leadership styles that need to be employed dependent upon the follower you are attempting to lead. I'm a big advocate of this thing called situational leadership, meaning this. Leaders adjust how they lead based on the needs of the followers. And I have run across too many so-called leaders in business who would say it's up to employees to alter who they are based on what I want. They were not thinking about the follower. But I'm going to try to help you to see not only can we identify the type of follower you are, but the type of leadership that would help you to thrive. And I think that's critically important, especially in a congregation, that we all understand the different types of followers and the different types of leaders that need to exist. And then we're going to show how leaders can positively or negatively impact followers. So that's really on the docket for us, and we're going to improve skills in leading and following in the home and in the church. So going back to my point, purpose is at the heart of leadership. Purpose is at the heart of leadership. And this was already suggested, but I would like to suggest, when you look at Jesus Christ, in Luke 19:10, we're told, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus was purpose-driven. I don't think there was a day that Jesus lived on this earth that he wasn't recalling the reason he's here. And because that reason drove him, he attracted followers. So Jesus, as I said, the hallmark, the best example I can find anywhere of an effective leader. Paul, Philippians 3:14, he says, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Stop and think about it. If we stop and read between the lines, look at the missionary work that Paul was engaged in. He was continually looking forward to the heavenly home, and in his gratitude for his salvation, he was working nonstop. He was driven by having clarity of purpose and goal. The church, I think when Paul is writing to Timothy, he makes it pretty obvious what is the mission of the church of the living God, the pillar and the support of the truth. And then we can look into, and it was mentioned earlier, Joshua. Near the end of Joshua chapter 24:15 are the famous statement, choose whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You know, when Joshua made that declarative statement, he's telling us what's driving him. Service to the Lord. And I would be willing to infer, I would be willing to bet that every child in Joshua's household, his wife, his servants, they knew, because he was such a good leader, that he was about serving the Lord, and they adopted that same intent as he did. I just think he was also driven. Now, here's my point. Why is being clear about purpose so crucial to effective leadership? And you know, this occurred to me many years ago when I was teaching some of my leadership training. Why is purpose so crucial to leadership? And I would make this contention. Leadership conveys the idea of movement from here to there. The very word leadership suggests that I'm leading to someplace. Somebody once said that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Leaders have this ability to not only articulate where we're going, but they communicate it passionately all the time. And here's where we kind of look at dilemmas that arise in households and in churches and in businesses. A thing called the activity trap. And let me just share this with you. This actually, I read this in a zoology book years ago when I was attending Florida College. I was going to be a marine biologist at one point in my career, and then I ran smack dab into organic chemistry. It changed my career forever. But I remember in a zoology book at Florida College, I came across an interesting story about processionary caterpillars. Let me share that with you. Processionary caterpillars feed upon pine needles. They move through the trees in a long progression, one leading and the other following, each with his eyes half closed and his head snugly fitted against the rear extremity of his predecessor. Jean-Henri Fabre, the great French naturalist, after patiently experimenting with a group of the caterpillars, finally enticed them to the rim of a large flower pot. He succeeded in getting the first one connected up with the last one, thus forming a complete circle which started moving around in procession with neither beginning nor end. The naturalist expected that after a while they would catch on to the joke, get tired of their useless march, and start off in some new direction. But not so. Through sheer force of habit, the living, creeping circle kept moving around the rim of the pot. They went around and around, keeping the same relentless pace for 7 days and 7 nights, and would doubtless have continued longer had it not been for sheer exhaustion and ultimate starvation. Incidentally, an ample supply of food was close at hand and plainly visible, but it was outside the range of the circle. So they continued along the well-worn path. They were following instinct, habit, past experience, standard practice, or whatever you may choose to call it, but they were following blindly. They mistook activity for accomplishment. They meant well, but they got no place. This activity trap is pernicious, and it exists in a lot of places. Engaging in lots of activity but having lost sight of one's primary purpose is basically the definition of the activity trap. And I'm here to tell you it impacts government, it impacts businesses, it impacts schools, local churches, and even families. Stop and think for a few moments about public schools. What do you think should be the ultimate outcome, goal, mission of a public school? Educated kids? Educated kids? It's not hard, is it, to understand? Is that what we're getting? Have you not observed and watched how will graduate kids who are not functionally literate, incapable of existing in society, not educated, but how many activities are schools engaged in? And if you've got kids in school, you know, you're probably driving them to and from, back and forth, because of all of the activities that are going on. But it seems to me schools have somehow lost their primary purpose for being. Businesses do this all the time. Have you ever worked a business and you're doing something and you wonder, why am I doing this? There's no clarity between the activity you're engaged in and the ultimate ambition, the mission, the vision of the company with which you work for? Have you ever wondered about why we keep doing this? And it's because there's a lack of clarity about purpose and mission. Local churches, I mean, I'm amazed sometimes about all of the activities that are going on in Louisville by a lot of local churches. We're going to do this or we're going to do that, and all these activities going on, but I'm wondering, have they lost the primary intent of a local church to be the pillar and the support of the truth, to evangelize the world, to be a shining light in the community? But there's games and there's parties and there's this and there's that and there's all kinds of activities, but we have somehow lost sight of the reason for existing. And this reminds me very much of Isaiah. Malachi is another good place to turn as well. In Isaiah 29:13, the people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. This was epidemic in the Old Testament. Going through the motions, but having long forgotten why. To glorify God, to be obedient to God, to serve God. Yes, sir?
I'm sitting here thinking about our study on in Acts, we went to Acts, the 4th chapter, and Peter and John are telling the Sanhedrin, we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard.
Right.
That's the attitude of all Christians. That would be our goal.
Yep, pretty clear, weren't they? And nothing was going to keep them from what they knew their purpose for being was. Now, let me get a little closer to home here. Let me see where my next slide goes. This is a model that I share. This is on page 7 in your materials. This is what I do in businesses, but it works equally well in a home or in a church. Mission is crucial. What is our mission? And again, you don't have to answer this, but is there a mission for the church here? Is there a mission? From mission, once one articulates, and by the way, this is true of a household. So if you're a mom and a dad and kids in your house, have you articulated why we exist as a family? Is there a mission? From mission flow goals. Goals basically are general statements of intent. And from goals flow objectives. This is where we get measurable. It's not enough to say, for a church, we're going to evangelize the community. That might be a goal. But we need to say, let's put in place measures. We're going to canvass this neighborhood before the end of the third quarter. We're going to hand out this many mailings. Now you've got a measure in place to know whether you've done it, and that then leads to activities, the things done to accomplish the objectives. This is a natural flow for how one uses purpose to drive activities. But here's what happens. Mission gets foggy. And I've asked, is there a mission for this church? And I saw a lot of nods of assent. Do you know what it is? Could you tell me what it is? And I'm seeing some nods of assent here as well, and I'm happy to see that. Because I won't name the congregation, but there is a congregation where I share this. Here was their mission. We exist to teach the lost and to develop obedient and devoted followers who strengthen one another while glorifying God. In the midst of the session like we're having right now, I asked the question, does the church here have a mission? And there were blank looks. By the way, this was actually on the wall in the entryway. So people were passing by it and seeing it all the time. And so I would further refine my point, and that is what hangs on the wall isn't as important as what exists in the heart. It isn't enough to have a mission for a church or a mission for your family if nobody knows what it is. It needs to be communicated passionately over and over and over again to direct and to drive the activities that we engage in, so that the activities we engage in are aligned with why we exist. Let me share with you a story about a woman by the name of Florence Chadwick. Florence Chadwick was a world-renowned swimmer. By the time 4th of July 1952 arrived, she had already swung the English Channel successfully in both directions. That's a 21-mile swim. So she was known for her swimming ability. 4th of July 1952, Florence Chadwick determines that she's going to be the first woman to swim from Catalina Island to the California coast, a distance of 26 miles. If we have any marathoners in here, imagine swimming a marathon. So Florence Chadwick got in the water, began her historic swim. The water was bone-chilling cold. But Florence presses on. She's swimming, she's swimming, she's swimming. On either side of her was a small flotilla of boats, stationed in which were men with rifles whose job it was to drive off sharks who would get too near her. Florence is swimming, she's swimming, she's swimming. Somewhere in the middle of her swim, an unfortunate but not atypical event occurred. A fog bank rolled in on the California coast. Not unusual, but here's the effect that it had. Florence Chadwick is swimming, she's swimming, she's swimming, but now she can't see the California coast. All she sees ahead of her is fog. After 15 hours of swimming, Florence Chadwick tells her mother, who's in one of the boats beside her, I can't make it. She's encouraged by her mom to press on. Her trainer encourages her to press on. After 15 hours and 55 minutes, Florence Chadwick is taken out of the water, defeated in her effort to be the first woman to swim from Catalina Island to the California coast. After she had thought a bit, and some reporters came up to her, she said, look, it wasn't the bone-chilling cold of the water. It wasn't the sharks that get too near. She said, I couldn't see my goal. She was a half mile from the California coast. And if it had been a clear day, she would have seen the coast, and she is convinced nothing would have stopped her from getting there. She was defeated in her efforts because she couldn't see her goal. And that adds new significance, doesn't it, to the fact when Paul says, I press on to the goal of the upward call in Christ. He never lost sight of where he is going. Now, Florence Chadwick, thankfully, some months later, successfully made that swim. But it's one of my favorite stories because it kind of speaks to me about the problem that exists not only in homes but in churches, and that is that we sometimes lose sight of why we're here and what we're doing. And I would make this contention: good leaders continually engage in fog abatement. They're always asking the question, why are we doing this? Does this align with who we are and the purpose for which we exist? Be it a church or be it a home. And I'll speak to the men of the congregation who have families. This is equally important in the home, to be clear about why we're here. Paul's writing to the church in Ephesus, we're made for good works. Are we doing it? And so in your workbooks, and I just want to share this with you as we kind of bring this session, I have got a sample of a family mission, goals, and objectives. Now, my wife and I started this some years ago. When our kids were at home, we especially did this, but at the beginning of the year, we'd sit down and say, what's our mission for this year? What's our purpose? And you'll notice on the left-hand side, as for me and our house, we will serve the Lord. And then there are goals, and then there are objectives, and then there are possible activities. And I would even hasten to say this: it doesn't have to be this detailed. But I think there's a lot of value in that. Husbands and wives, kids if they're still home, let's stop and let's think about the year ahead. Because you know what? You can't be a leader if you don't know where you're going. We can aspire to leadership, but leadership conveys the idea of purpose and mission. And so if you would be a good leader, you need to be crystal clear about why we're here. Now, for those who might want it, I have a blank of this form. You're welcome to pick one up. There's nothing magical about it. But if you'd like to kind of take a stab at it, there are samples up here you can pull if you're interested. But I would also suggest, and it sounds like the church here is doing this, you can also do the same thing when we're looking at congregations. And here's a sample in your materials about congregational mission, goals, objectives, and activities. This, by the way, is one page of a 3-page document that a congregation of which I'm a part of, with the men and women of the congregation, tried to sit down and articulate who we are, why we exist, where are we going. And that's why I would suggest it's best when it's a collaborative effort. And we'll speak more about the importance of collaboration in charting direction tomorrow. But this is really kind of what I wanted to do as my positioning session. You really can't talk about leadership unless there is great clarity of purpose. And it sounds to me, just from the nods of assent that I see here, that you're well under the way here. And that's great, because I'm telling you, there are a lot of congregations I ask, what's the mission? And there's no clue. I ask dads, wives in homes, do you have a mission for your family? Doesn't happen very often. Does it matter? It matters. Because there's a lot of fog in the world, a lot of things designed to distract us, a lot of things designed to get us unfocused. And frankly, you can't be a very good leader unless you're crystal clear on where you're going. All right, let me pause here. We have a couple of minutes left in this hour, but I want to pause and see if there's any questions that anybody has, comments that you'd like to make. Does it make sense? Okay, let me let you know where we're going to be going. tomorrow, we're really going to get into some really interesting insights. This is where I am going to give you some practical, usable tools about how to be a more effective leader and the different types of followers that exist. All right, so I hope that you'll come back. There'll be some more activities tomorrow. We're actually going to look at actual examples of good and bad leadership in Scripture and understand why. So a lot more engagement. Come with your pens and your books, and we'll take up this discussion tomorrow with session 2. All right, any final comments, questions before we call it an evening? Yes?
So is this being recorded so we can come back and listen to it?
I'm told yes. And since you have the workbook, you should be able to follow along. Yeah, the sessions tomorrow is where I get a lot of people in business who go, this is the best thing I've ever heard about how to be an effective leader. So if you want practical tools, you don't want to miss it. It's this, and I told you, David, when he introduced me, I run a company, my own company called Leading Wave Consulting. We do leadership and management training, performance management training, motivation training, we do all kinds of, this particular module has repeatedly gotten from the Motorola's of the world, the McDonald's of the world, who are some of my clients. I've had managers and leaders say this is the most useful and practical tools they've ever seen on the subject. So that's kind of my enticement. Be back tomorrow. A lot of things that are going to be vying for your attention, but I think it'll be time well spent. All right, thank you so much for your kind attention. I think we resume tomorrow at 9:30, so I look forward to continuing this journey with you. Thank you very much.